I'm Sarah Fensky, and this is the 314. Every episode, we sit down with St. Louisans who know what makes this place tick. Together, we explore why things are the way they are and how we can make them better. This episode of the 314 podcast is sponsored by Westport Plaza. It's been a rough year for independent media in St. Louis. The Riverfront Times got rid of all of its journalists, its print edition, and its St. Louis focus. Sauce laid off all but one editorial staffer. KDHX is selling its broadcast license to a Christian pop station. But Chris Ando still believes in local media, and print media no less. In February, he purchased the LGBTQ publication Out in STL from its owner for $1. Last week, the magazine published its first issue under a new nonprofit board. Now, in just a moment, St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Kroll will join us to talk about the surprising success of a St. Louis public school and how the tornado that ripped through town in May threatens that. But first, let's hear from the new executive editor and CEO of Out in STL. He's relaunched the magazine at a tough time for print media and for the LGBTQ community, yet he refuses to give up hope or give up on St. Louis. Chris Ando, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And congratulations. This is just a big month for you.
It is.
You went from buying this publication, this was a few months back, to setting up a new ownership structure, to putting out this issue. You did that all in just 4 months.
Right.
So this must have just felt like a whirlwind.
It was building a nonprofit while at the same time building a print product and selling that print product. It was, and having edited this off and on since 2017, I knew about the editorial side, but I never knew about the sales, the production, everything else that went into it. So it was a learning curve.
Yeah, you got this crash course in owning a magazine, but you owned it and almost immediately decided you were going to turn it over to a board of directors, make it a nonprofit, and specifically a 501c4.
That is correct. NAACP is a 501c4, meaning they can be political. And I used that as a model. I didn't want to be a C3 and be so confined with what we could say, because the community needs an authentic voice. We don't need someone who has to watch their words so carefully.
And I want to get into sort of the activism here in a moment. But I think bigger question, you could have been a magazine mogul. You could have just owned this as an individual. What made you decide, no, I'm going to set up this board of directors. I'm going to have this structure where you're just the editor?
I wanted this to be so much bigger than myself. I wanted it to have legs. I wanted it to carry on after I was out of the picture. And a nonprofit, people are eager to invest. And if we all share ownership, then people are much more willing to contribute. And so I thought this is a great opportunity to open this up and make it a true community asset.
People might have assumed if you had a for-profit structure that you were there to just get rich. But I think you and I both know about magazines. That doesn't happen. And that really hasn't happened with this. You put this out, this issue, this lovely glossy issue I have in front of me. This was truly a labor of love. You didn't get paid a dime for your work on this.
No, I didn't. We were just wanting to get it out. We have some incredible advertisers we encourage people to support. But we had enough ads that we were able to produce the issue. That means the ad rep, Kat Criswell, did it pro bono.
She did not get paid.
She did not get paid.
Wow.
And I didn't. In the future, we do expect to, but it was a challenge to convince advertisers to buy something they hadn't seen yet.
Yeah.
But plenty did. Enough did that we were able to fund thousands of copies of this issue.
And you were able to get this issue to break even. You didn't lose any money on this lovely print issue.
That is correct.
Okay. So that must feel like a huge celebration.
It does.
That was kind of the goal there, to break even.
That was the goal. I mean, we had a modest goal. It was not about the money. It was about getting something out there the community could be proud of, especially in the middle of the dark times we're facing.
So that leads us right back to this activism. This is a more political tone, I think, than I have seen on the cover of Out in STL in all the years it's been printing and all the years that you have in the past been an editor of it. Your cover story is The Fighters.
Right.
What made that the right story for this moment in time?
So in 2017, we have to look at the contrast between then and now.
And that is when this magazine launched.
That is when we launched in 2017. We were on the cusp of entering the mainstream. You know, we even had drag queens in tiny DeSoto, Missouri's Christmas parade.
Wow.
That's how much drag was not a big deal. As far as trans people using the restroom, candidate Trump back then was asked what he thought about it, and he kind of winced, like this is not, something he wanted to talk about, and that whatever the situation was working fine. And so, yeah, everything was a lot different. And this launched as a lighthearted lifestyle magazine with the intent that at least half the readers were going to be straight women.
Hmm.
And so we just kind of had fun. I mean, yes, there were serious topics. We did cover a lot of the struggles, especially of the trans community and so forth. But we were generally a lighthearted publication. The needs are very different. The floor has fallen out in our support, and we have to relaunch under those new circumstances.
When did you realize just how far that support had crumbled in this America that we're in right now? What was the moment for you?
Well, election night, I think, was a big one.
But Trump had been elected before.
He had,
This was his second bite of that apple.
but it was, 215 million ad dollars were spent on just demonizing trans people. And if you spent 215 million to convince people to hate the Gateway Arch, people would. That is why ads exist. Persuasion. If you had a campaign against anything, if I said Sarah Finsky's the biggest problem in St. Louis, and I'm going to spend 215 million about it, I could convince a lot of people.
I don't think you'd have to spend that much, Chris, frankly. You could probably do that for a cold 1 million, but
Sure. So yeah, election and just kind of the way corporate America just ran, that was, it's been just a really jarring experience.
they've sort of taken their cues maybe from the political moment. They've decided to say, we're going to just jettison our support for the LGBTQ community. I think the most prominent example locally has been Pride Fest, which was long sponsored by Anheuser-Busch. They didn't give a dime to this year's festival. That was a sobering moment.
I mean, it goes across the board. General Motors produced these slick videos about what an ally they were. And then just recently, they just dropped altogether. We're not doing anything for Pride at all.
Wow. Do you guys feel like you've been abandoned?
Yeah, definitely. I have to believe it's temporary. I think the pendulum swings. I think we're in this unique moment that is going to be useful. I think sometimes it's really good to see where you truly stand and kind of take the rose-colored glasses off. And I think it's going to make us stronger and smarter going forward.
You wrote in your editor's note in this new issue, you wrote that some people had been doubting the purpose of the LGBTQ community, quote, arguing the notion of community was a relic of the days before the apps and legal protections. November's election put that argument to bed. Do you feel like the community is galvanized, that people now realize they need each other and they need to be fighters?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a lot of people who maybe even 1 year ago didn't seem particularly political have come around, but when, our drag bars in particular, sometimes 60-70% of the people were suburban women that were at those shows. And we all thought that meant that they were supporters, and they were supporters in the same way that Taco Bell customers are supporters of Mexican culture.
They were not with you in the voting booth.
They weren't, and so they would come to have fun, but they weren't truly our friends. And so that has been the wake-up call that we're dealing with. And I'm an optimist by nature. There's a lot of people in the community who are really depressed and they're really struggling. And the barrage of bad news, especially for the trans community, just boom, 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 boom. I mean, sometimes multiple bad news cycles a week, pretty much every day there's a new horror. And there's some people that are just depressed all the time. I think my superpower is compartmentalizing. And I just think in any given moment, what can I do? And I think the community doesn't need me to be depressed. They need me to do what I do. And so I try to find the joy. I try to find the optimism. I can.
Yeah, so even though your cover story is about the fighters and the magazine has a great tribute to Stephen Holdsworth, a longtime activist who died in April, that's obviously very serious and it's written in this galvanizing tone that we can sort of pick up the mantle of his activism. At the same time, you do also have these stories that are about culture, that are
Yes.
about fun things. You're not just making this a magazine that will appeal to people who want to fight. It appeals to a much broader
Oh,
spectrum. Was
absolutely.
that intentional?
Absolutely. Yeah, we will always balance out the best parts of us and I love our culture. I love everything that makes us so vibrant and interesting. And I say that my goal with the magazine has always been to introduce the community to itself and introduce the overall community to us. And I noted in my editor's letter that Troy Perry, who founded the National Affiliation of Metropolitan Community Churches, was once asked, "Why do you have to come out to every single person you meet?" And he said, "Because to know us is to love us." And I want someone who's not maybe on board with us to be able to pick up the magazine and find, see it through our eyes, see our community through our eyes.
Do you feel like that suburban woman who got to know you, who was there at the drag show and was enjoying as that was going on, if she could maybe understand some of the fuller life that you present in this magazine, that maybe she'd vote a different way? Is that part of what you're up to here?
It is possible. I also want us to be able to flex our muscle. It's always been amazing to me that Kansas City and St. Louis have so little political sway in
In the state of
Missouri.
Missouri, yes.
And I think it's because we haven't flexed our muscles, haven't worked out, And so my goal is also to get like-minded people together. I highlight Promo, the advocacy organization in here, and I'm determined to keep doing that. A lot of times, I think people are disengaged because they feel it's hopeless, and they're like, the Republicans control everything. It's not worth it. But there is so much work to strip out the worst parts of bad legislation. So there are wins. And I think part of my optimistic superpower is to educate people. Hey, we actually achieved, like the drag ban in 2023. They came up with this drag ban that would have kept drag queens from being at Pride or anywhere. And our advocates went there and fought them.
And they won that
And they
battle.
won, Jordan Braxton, chief among them, Maxie Glamour. They went and twisted arms and found the co-sponsor of the bill, who was a gay Republican, ironically. And Jordan Braxton said, "What are you doing? You've been to my shows. How are you sponsoring this?" And he backed down and no one else took it up. And so there are wins. There are a lot of wins. And I think if we encourage people and enlighten them on our successes, then they'll get on board and be more willing to fight.
We're talking today to Chris Ando. He's the editor-in-chief of Out in STL. The magazine has existed since 2017, but for the first time with this issue that is out this month, it is now being run by a nonprofit board of directors. That's something that Chris personally put into place. We're going to return to our conversation in just a moment. First, a word from our sponsor. A modern take on Italian cuisine has arrived at Westport Plaza. Basso on the Plaza, sister restaurant to the beloved Basso at the Cheshire, is open now. Basso offers a local made-from-scratch menu inspired by rustic Italian flavors. From house-made pasta and bread to Neapolitan pizzas, every dish ensures a fresh and flavorful dining experience. Experience the warm, welcoming space and enjoy the aromas from the open kitchen and the cozy glow of the fireplace. Visit basso-stl.com/Westport or follow them on Instagram at Basso Westport for all the latest information. And today, of course, I'm talking to Chris Ando. He's an author. He's also editor-in-chief of Out in STL, and he's showing off their new issue here, which is amazing. Chris, we were talking about how corporations have sort of left the LGBT community that they once courted so assiduously. That makes for a pretty hard time to launch a magazine. You're going to need corporate ad dollars. Can this magazine be sustained as a quarterly with this climate that we're in?
We have a lot of local advertisers in here, and I'd like people to pay attention to that and to support them and encourage them to keep advertising with us. A local realtor, several entertainment venues, and we were able to do this from that. And we also have queer tourism. So the District Hotel in Oklahoma City, which is a big queer destination, advertised with us. We're in talks with Choose Chicago for the next issue. So there is a market, and I think there's going to be a very strong market because there's few choices for advertisers to openly support the community in this way.
Yeah, and there's not as much competition. St. Louis used to have so many different print publications that were out there.
Yes.
At one point, there were multiple LGBTQ publications.
Sure.
You got your start at one. This was the Vital Voice.
Yes, the Vital Voice is where it all started. I was telling stories on Facebook, and Darren Slyman contacted me and asked me if I would write for Vital Voice. And I was like, oh my, I'm a magazine writer now.
And it all started because you were telling stories on Facebook?
I was telling stories on Facebook, and I was telling stories. I had lost everything in the 2008 financial crisis. I was living in Oklahoma City after living in San Francisco for many years, and put everything in real estate. The market collapsed. And I just needed to process what was going on and tell people how much it sucked. It's kind of therapy for me. I just needed to write about this. And for the first time in my life, I discovered that sharing bad news is a draw.
Oh, people flock to your Facebook page.
Like when you are just putting on that sheen, everything's great, I'm so successful, blah, blah, blah. There's nothing for people to hold on to.
Yeah.
But if you're like, you wouldn't believe what my boss did to me. They sit down. Everybody wants to sit and talk about it. And so that was how it all started. And then I started writing. I was always interested in St. Louis as a city. I've lived here 3 times. I've been back 11 years now. And I would just write about that. And I had events where people came from around the country, based on my stories of this city. I say it's like a larger Savannah from Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil, with these eccentric characters and these long plot lines. And, in San Francisco, it turns over so much that you can't get that same beat. It's just all too ephemeral.
Whereas our quirky people, they tend to stick around.
They do. And even when they're faced with a major scandal, most cities, if you're faced with a major scandal, you slink on to the next town and start over. I always say St. Louis is where the disgraced stay in place. You just wait it out.
And it works.
And it works.
You and I have seen people do this multiple times.
How long can you feign outrage? If that person just doesn't leave, you're just like, well, I guess.
Hearing you talk about St. Louis right now, it just always lifts my spirit. You see this town in a way that to me feels very accurate, but that not many people see it the same way that you do. I feel like you have both a romantic view of St. Louis, but you're also capable of kind of gently laughing at it.
Well, I think I am enough of an insider to know what's going on and enough of an outsider to know what makes that interesting. Since I was not from here, did not grow up here. And, it all started after college. I was in Oklahoma City. And I was figuring out what I was going to do next. I wanted to go to a bigger city, but I wanted to be within a day's drive of my family, which are in Tulsa. And so everyone in Oklahoma moves to Dallas. So there was no adventure in that. And I always say they moved to Dallas and act like they conquered Paris. They were so insufferable when they'd come home to visit or what have you. At the time, this is the 1997, Colorado was a red state, and they had just passed this very anti-gay Amendment 2. So Denver was out. Kansas City seemed nice, but just seemed like a bigger Tulsa, my hometown. But then there was St. Louis, and I knew nothing about it except it was an old city by comparison to anything west of here. And a friend of mine came here regularly on business. And I said, so what's St. Louis like? He said, oh, it's awful. He said, the best way I can describe it is it's like Gotham City. It's really old and crumbling with these crowded row houses and soot-stained buildings and smokestacks, and there's this sketchy subway under it. And everything he told me just blew my mind. I was like, there is a city that interesting within 6 hours of Tulsa. I was just blown away.
You on it.
Everything bad I heard just piqued my imagination. And it has never let me down as far as this interesting, bizarre place that I just dig into.
And you've moved back here twice now. What made you leave and then come back? I know in each case there were probably different stories, but what kept bringing you back to this place?
So when, I guess it was when Bush got in office, I tried to move to Vancouver. And that didn't work out. I didn't have a skill that Canada was short of. And They didn't let me there. So I moved to San Francisco to wait out the Bush years then. And then I got offered, an old college landlord offered me this amazing turnkey real estate opportunity in Oklahoma City that was just too good to pass up. And I looked at the real estate, saw I could buy a big Amityville looking house in Oklahoma City. And my best friend was there. So I went to Oklahoma City for 18 months before the bottom fell out. And then came back here dead broke. And, basements south of St. Louis, no one has basements. And, basements are where you put the things that are way too good to throw out, but you don't know what else to do with them. So I moved back to town and everyone just opened their basements. Every time I moved back, it looked like Crate and Barrel, it was all nice things. So I moved back and then reestablished myself, was very, very happy. And then my ex-husband, who was my current husband at the time, wanted to go back to California again. And I had already done it and it broke my heart to do it.
But you went.
Yeah, I went and then was there for another 4 years. So it was 4 years the first time and then 4 years the second time. And then we were going to get divorced. And so I said, well, New York was the unfinished business of my life. I called my brother. I said, I'm going to come stay with you. And New York chewed me up and spat me out. I was there for just a few months. Real estate pays the bills. Mostly property management, and every recruiter said, nobody's going to hire you without Manhattan experience.
It was just a closed system.
Yeah. And I mean, no one thinks, and they considered me a Californian, but they were like, Californians are too soft. You can't hang, in Manhattan. And I was also extremely depressed. My life had just fallen apart.
Yeah.
And New York is not a place you go and lick your wounds. Right. And so, but I was getting job offers in all the surrounding areas. So Philly, Hartford, and I almost took a job in Philly. And I sat in the park late at night in New York, and I just was having this brainstorm. I said, why am I getting ready to move to a city where I know nobody, to take a job that's so much like the job I was so happy to leave in Berkeley? And then it clicked. I need to downshift and go finish my book. I had my first book that I had been on the back burner for years. I thought the only good thing about the divorce, I had no debt.
Yeah.
And so I just moved to St. Louis to finish my book and never left.
And it was that that time that you were in St. Louis that you kind of found your calling as a writer, not just finish the book, but also, you're writing for the Vital Voice. You ended up getting recruited to be the editor of this new publication out in STL. And now writing has become such a big part of your life and your identity. Do you feel like that would have happened if you had ended up in any of these other cities?
No, I mean, I think the collapse, the 2008 collapse, changed the course of my life and ended up being a good thing. It was a terrible thing at the time, but had my life just continued, I would have stayed in Oklahoma City. And I like Oklahoma City, and I have good friends there. It has a lot going for it, but it's not the inspiration that St. Louis was. It's not the complex, gritty, multifaceted place that this is that's inspired my writing. And so, yeah, it turns out that a calamitous collapse is just what I needed.
Do you think that's maybe what gives you that sort of essential optimism, that you see how this has led to good things for you, that maybe deep down inside you're wondering, could this terrible moment for the LGBT community lead it to a better place?
I think so. I think being an optimist in any situation, I think, what is the bright side of this? And when the moment happened, I was living actually in Oakland the last year I was in the Bay Area. And I was so lonely, and and I missed this place. I wrote in my journal at the time, after seeing on Facebook my friends in St. Louis buying houses and having barbecues and all this. I wrote, some people feel they're wasting their lives because they're in St. Louis. I feel like I'm wasting mine because I'm not. I just felt like I was missing all these authentic experiences. And so, yeah, I'm always, so when I realized my marriage was over, all of a sudden I thought, wait a minute, I don't have to live in Oakland. No diss on Oakland. I was just lonely there.
Yeah.
And I tried out New York. But yeah, in any bad situation, my mind immediately goes, what's the upside? And so, all of these corporations that are turning their backs on us, it's been an education. And anyone who shies away from us now, it's an education. And I think it has renewed a sense of community. And I believe that's a good thing.
You have on the cover of this issue, the tagline across the top is, "You can't keep a good mag down, honey." I love that. It kind of has that sassy tone, but it also has that optimism that's at the core of who you were.
And that's actually Evan Salt came up with that. He's
The art
SLO
director.
art director.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, heterosexual art director. Yeah, he's the one who came up with that. He's very clever.
And you feel like now this is out there. You can pick this up at bars or restaurants
Yeah.
around town. You can't keep a good mag down.
You can't.
Chris Ando, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Chris is the CEO and executive editor of Out in STL. Now, in just a moment, Ryan Kroll joins us for the closer. But first, a word from our sponsor. This episode of the 314 podcast is supported by the Missouri History Museum. St. Louis employers take pride in their city. Share that excitement with your team, whether they're new to the Lou or lifelong locals, and take part in the New to St. Louis STL 101 tour from the Missouri Historical Society. Hear from local history experts, explore neighborhoods, oddities, and landmarks, and then wrap it all up with a happy hour featuring iconic St. Louis foods and local beers. Who knew team building could be this much fun? Book your tour today at mohistory.org/STL101. And now for the closer. 4 years ago, St. Louis's Sumner High School came perilously close to closing. The storied public school had graduated more bold-faced names than just about any other in the Midwest, but it had low enrollment and not much in the way of student success. As St. Louis Magazine staff writer Ryan Kroll reported last week, that's changed in a big way. But now the tornado may put those gains in jeopardy, and he joins us now to explain why. Ryan Kroll, welcome.
Hey, yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to talk about this one.
So 4 years ago, when Sumner was close to closing, the community stepped up to save it in a big way. So why was that? What made this high school such a rallying point?
Sure. So it a couple different things. It's a school that's been around for 150 years, basically. So it has this sort of very long story tradition. And even though it was founded in the sort of 1800s, it was really like in the 20th century, I think, is kind of what this school is known for. It produced these it's like incredible alumni. I really feel like the alumni from this school could rival almost any high school in the country, like Chuck Berry, Tina Turner, Arthur Ashe. Just these like really sort of household names all came from this one high school in the Ville in North City. But it had sort of kind of gradually fallen on hard times up until when, in just like about a decade ago, I think at least the pastor across the street from the school told me that whenever he arrived in that neighborhood, which would have been about a decade ago, there was only like 100 students or 150 students at this school, which was like a century, low. It was just, it really had not been that sort of low of an enrollment in a long time. So kind of from having this huge cultural impact, this incredible sort of alumni roster, to sort of really kind of just hanging on by a thread as recently as shortly before the pandemic.
Yeah, and you could see why the St. Louis Public School District would look at this as a school that maybe they should close. They are under serious pressure to find some schools to close. They have too many buildings, not enough pupils. But in this case, people did not want to see this historic touchstone close. So what was the plan?
Yeah, well, I guess just to piggyback off of that, sort of like on paper, you might see like why they might want to close this, but that maybe doesn't account for sort of, how important it is kind of in this sort of like collective history of St. Louis. And then the plan to sort of resurrect the school, it was really a lot of folks from the community who really, it was this one group in particular called For the Ville, a neighborhood group in the Ville, in North St. Louis. They really sort of rallied behind this school, and they put together this plan that, would basically sort of lean or into, I guess you could say, the arts history of the school, kind of those big, alumni in music and other performing arts. And what they would do is they would partner with other arts organizations in the city, like Opera Theater of St. Louis, the Muni, the Shakespeare Festival. And they would work with these organizations to kind of really build up the school's performing arts kind of credentials and programs. And the kind of short version is basically what they did was they brought in folks from those organizations. They got them in the schools, and then they took the students from the school and they put them in those arts organizations out in the city, out in the community, and really tried to kind of create this, collaboration and really sort of sparking like a new sort of way of thinking about these kind of public-private partnerships in education that I think the ultimate goal, which I feel like they kind of were getting close to achieving, was like, not only can this sort of save Sumner, it might also be like a blueprint for other schools that are sort of similarly situated, something that they could do to sort of, revitalize other schools that were kind of also at a low point.
And as you're saying, they were doing this. They were finding some big results. They
Yeah.
put out a report that sort of details what they were able to achieve. What were some of the highlights?
Sure. So basically, even though that was kind of like an arts-focused approach that I just described, the results sort of extended well beyond just students, flourishing in the arts. Basically, the two things that really caught my eye in this report that came out very recently was that enrollment had increased significantly by I think it was about 50%.
Mm.
And the school back in 2019 entered into this MOU with SLPS that said they were going to grow enrollment. I want to say it was by 5% every
So they
academic
blew
year.
that out of the water.
Blew it out of the water, exactly. They were slated for the academic year that's going to start in the fall to have just a little bit south of 500 students.
So that's really good. That's where you want to be.
Exactly. And then the other kind of really impressive statistic is that their graduation rate for African American students, and this is a predominantly African American student body, was the 4-year graduation rate was 92%.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the school system in general, its graduation rate for African American students is something like 75%. So they were blowing more than just the enrollment numbers out of the water. These kids were really, kind of flourishing here.
So big success story. And then we get this tornado in May. And suddenly Sumner ends up on this list of 6 schools that are temporarily closed. Now, the district has stressed that this is temporary, that they plan to reopen all of these schools. But how do they end up on this list? Is this just about damage to the building? What's going on here?
Yeah, well, there is some damage to the building, but I gotta say, I went by and it looked, considering it went through a tornado, it looked pretty good, right? There was some tarps on the roof, not even the whole roof. It was just a portion of the roof. And it was one of those situations where the sort of tarps were clearly sitting on a solid structure.
Yeah.
In recent weeks, we've seen a lot of video and footage of sort of tarps kind of acting as the sort of roof. That was not the case here. It was clearly a much sort of more minor damage that, you never want to see a tarp on your roof. But considering that there was that, it didn't look very bad.
That's about it. I'm not seeing bricks that were down. I'm not seeing trees that were uprooted. If you had showed me a picture of this school and I didn't know there'd been a tornado in St. Louis, I would not have thought there'd been a tornado.
You would think it was undergoing some sort of relatively minor repair or something like that.
So what's going on? Is this tornado a pretext to close the school?
Well, that's what some people in the community are worried about. And I don't think folks who are kind of working with For the Ville, they were kind of careful not to say that they, whenever the SLPS Superintendent Millicent Borchardt says that, this is a temporary closure until we can sort of do the necessary repairs, they don't want to sort of challenge that idea, at least publicly, because they just don't think that's warranted right now. But however, there are people in the community who do worry that this is kind of one step in the, we're going to not open it in the fall. And that's kind of the first step in sort of a more permanent closure. And I think maybe too, another thing that kind of really struck me was this idea that this school, really sort of bootstrapped its recovery. This was a lot of elbow grease, a lot of hard work. And it seems like the SLPS, the district, whenever they say, we're going to do these repairs, we're going to fix it, and then we'll open it back up, they're really kind of not matching that same energy. They seem to kind of be a little more casual about all this. And I think there is that kind of mismatch of sort of enthusiasm and intention here that I think is probably rightfully rubbing some people the wrong way.
Yeah, and you can see how people might be a little bit distrustful of the St. Louis Public School District. This is a district that has had its share of troubles. Now, we have a new superintendent who's here, but she was hired by the old superintendent who was toppled. You had a school board that went along with a lot of that stuff. Now you have a different school board, a lot of new people on there, some new energy, but there is some distrust, I would say, throughout the community. So what is the district telling you? I mean, you confronted them directly about Sumner.
Yeah, they said basically unequivocally there's no plans to close Sumner. We're only temporarily closing it for the fall and relocating the students until we can, repair the roof, essentially do the necessary repairs. But yeah, there is distrust with the district and disconnect between the folks who see themselves mostly as sort of Sumner boosters, right? They care about this sort of specific school, and they are wary of the sort of larger school system. Sumner is sort of very important to them, and I think that they are skeptical that maybe it's as important to the school district as the school district says that it is. Again, I guess to be fair, Superintendent Borsche did say that like the Sumner success is like one of the sort of really key successes in the district in the last few years. But that, it's easy to say, right? One thing to sort of tell you that. I think that the folks at Sumner who are working for Sumner really want to kind of see the district show that in addition to just sort of saying it.
Well, people can read your story at stlmag.com. I know you're going to stay on this story. Ryan Kroll, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
That is Ryan Kroll, staff writer at St. Louis Magazine. I'm Sarah Fensky, and that's the 314 for today. You can find out more in our podcast show notes and at stlmag.com. You can also find me and Ryan every day in your inbox. That's thanks to St. Louis Magazine's fantastic free newsletter, St. Louis Daily. It's a fresh take on St. Louis with insight and original reporting. Sign up at stlmag.com/newsletters. The 314 is a production of St. Louis Magazine. I'm Sarah Fensky, and this is the 314. See you next time.